Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Great. Today, we're going to tackle California's workers' comp system,
Oh, okay.
specifically how they evaluate permanent disability.
Interesting.
We're looking at Chapter 10 from a text on California workers' comp.
Right.
And let me tell you, this stuff is way more interesting than it sounds.
I agree. It's a system that really affects a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure.
Whether you're an employer, employee, or just curious,
Totally.
understanding how it all works can be so valuable.
Absolutely.
It's complicated.
And get this, I was reading that doctors don't actually decide the final disability rating?
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised by that.
Really?
Their role is super important, but they're more like
Like what?
like investigators,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
They piece together what happened with the injury.
Okay, so they're figuring out how the injury impacts the person's life.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now. So, first things first, what's the big picture here? What are we trying to do with these permanent disability evaluations?
The main goal is to figure out basically how much a worker's ability to function
Okay.
has been affected by a work-related injury or illness.
Right.
And then from there, we figure out the compensation.
Gotcha. So, like, how much money they should get.
Exactly.
So it's about finding that balance, right, between the medical reality of the injury
Yes.
and the actual impact on their life.
Exactly.
So it's not just about physical limitations, like if they can't lift heavy things anymore.
Right. It's broader than that.
Okay.
We have to be clear about the difference between impairment
Okay.
and disability.
Oh, I see.
So impairment is like the actual loss of function.
Okay, so if you can't move your arm as well as you used to,
Exactly.
that's impairment.
Disability is how that limits what you can do, like your job or daily tasks.
Oh, okay, so like that same arm injury
Right.
might not matter much for an office worker,
Yeah.
but could be really bad for a construction worker.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So we've got doctors examining, evaluating, writing reports. Who else is involved in this whole process?
Well, you've got claims administrators
Okay.
and then attorneys for both the workers and the employers.
Oh, right, of course.
And then there's the Disability Evaluation Unit. We call it DEU.
The DEU. Got it.
They're the ones who come up with the disability rating.
So they're kind of like the judges making the final decision.
Yeah, in a way, they take what the doctors say
Okay.
and use a special system to determine the rating, which impacts the benefits.
Okay, so let's talk more about those doctors. Their evaluations seem super important.
They are.
What happens if there's like disagreement about what the doctor found?
Then we go to the QME process. QME stands for Qualified Medical Evaluator.
So it's basically another medical exam, like a second opinion.
Exactly.
Okay.
If the worker or the employer doesn't agree with the first evaluation,
Right.
they can ask for a QME.
So what happens if the worker has a lawyer?
Then the worker and employer pick a QME together.
And if they don't have a lawyer?
If they don't have a lawyer, then the state just randomly picks a QME.
Oh.
And here's the thing. For workers without lawyers, this one QME evaluation can be make or break.
Really?
The employer only has to pay for one.
So that's a lot riding on just one evaluation.
It really is.
So after the QME sees the worker, they write their report, and then that goes to the DEU.
Well, hold on. There's another layer here.
Oh, boy.
It's called the AMA Guides to the Evaluation of Permanent Impairment.
AMA guides. Sounds official.
It is. It's like the rule book
The rule book for what?
for how to determine impairment.
Gotcha.
It can be a lot to take in, but it's all about making sure these evaluations are objective.
Objective, like everyone's using the same standard.
Yes, exactly. Back in 2003, California shifted away from more subjective ways of doing things.
So before 2003, it was kind of like the Wild West.
You could say that.
So now everyone's following the same playbook.
Exactly. It helps keep things fair.
Makes sense. So how do these AMA guides actually work?
Well, they focus on something called whole person impairment,
Oh,
or WPI.
WPI, guys.
It's a percentage
Okay.
that shows how badly the impairment affects someone's ability to do activities of daily living.
Activities of daily living, like
Yeah.
basic stuff.
Exactly. Brushing your teeth, getting dressed, walking.
Oh, okay. So like everyday things you just do without thinking.
Right. And the AMA guides look at how much the impairment stops you from doing those things.
So it's not just about the injury itself,
Right.
but how it affects your actual life.
Precise.
Interesting. So for each type of injury,
Yeah.
the AMA guides have rules for how to figure out the impairment level.
Exactly.
And I bet it gets pretty specific.
It does. For example, let's say it's a back injury.
Okay.
The guides tell you how to evaluate things like
Like what?
range of motion, strength, even pain levels.
Wait, pain, yeah, I thought you said the AMA guides were about objective stuff, like measurements.
They are.
So how does pain fit in?
Well, they acknowledge the pain is part of it, even though it's subjective.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
a doctor can add up to 3% to the WPI if the pain is more than expected for the injury.
So it's not just about how much pain the person says they have,
Right.
but how much it actually affects their daily life.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Okay, but what if someone has multiple injuries, like a back injury and a shoulder injury?
Good question.
Do you just add up the percentages from each injury?
That's where the combined values chart comes in.
Combined values chart.
Yeah, it's part of the AMA guides.
Okay.
It helps combine multiple impairment ratings.
Into one overall WPI.
Right. But it makes sure it never goes over 100%.
Oh, that's important.
It is.
So even if all the individual injuries add up to more than 100,
Right?
the total WPI can't go above 100.
Exactly.
That seems like a crucial detail, especially for someone with multiple injuries.
It is. You make sure the assessment is balanced.
Okay, so the AMA guides seem pretty comprehensive, but what about those cases that are, really unusual, where the standard rules don't quite fit?
That's where we get to the Almaraz-Guzman standard.
Almaraz-Guzman.
Yes. But maybe we should save that for later.
Okay.
We could dig into the spine chapter first.
All right, the spine chapter. That seems like a big one.
It is.
What makes spinal evaluations so complicated?
Well, the spine itself is super complex.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Lots of vertebrae, discs, nerves, so many things that can go wrong.
Right.
And back injuries are so common at work.
Mm-hmm.
So the AMA guides have a whole chapter just for evaluating them.
Makes sense. So how does that work? How do they evaluate a spinal injury using the AMA guides?
There are two main ways.
Okay.
There's the diagnosis-related estimate, or DRE,
DRE.
and then the range of motion method, or ROM.
Okay, so DRE and ROM. Break those down for me.
The DRE is for simpler cases, like if there's a fracture,
Okay.
you can easily categorize the impairment based on the diagnosis.
So it's like you have a list of categories and you pick the one that fits.
Exactly.
All right, what about the ROM method?
That's for cases that are more complex, where you can't just pick a category.
Okay.
It involves actually measuring the spine's range of motion.
I see. So you're actually seeing how much they can move their spine.
Right. And also looking for any problems with nerves or muscles.
So it's a much more detailed evaluation.
It is.
Gotcha. So DRE is like multiple choice, ROM is like writing an essay,
I like that.
and I imagine accuracy is super important in both cases.
Absolutely.
You mentioned something about consistency earlier.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
So it's not just about getting the measurements right.
Okay.
The doctor has to watch the worker carefully
Okay.
and make sure they're putting in the same effort every time.
So, like, if their range of motion is totally different each time they measure it,
Exactly. That could be a sign that something's not right.
so it's about making sure they're really showing their limitations,
Right.
not trying to exaggerate or downplay them.
Exactly.
That makes sense, but it sounds like it takes a lot of skill from the doctor.
It does. They have to use their judgment.
And what about things like back braces or walkers? Those assistive devices.
Oh, good point.
Do they evaluate the person with or without the device?
It depends.
On what?
If it's something you could easily take off, they might do both.
So they'd evaluate them with and without the device.
Right. And report both results.
Okay.
But if it's something more permanent, like a spinal fusion,
Okay.
then they evaluate with a device.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to penalize someone for using something that helps them.
Exactly.
What about cases where the treatment itself has caused more problems?
Lasagna effects.
Yeah, exactly. Like side effects from medication.
Those can definitely be factored into the rating.
So it's not just about the initial injury,
Right.
but also any problems caused by the treatment.
It's about the whole picture.
That's good to know. We've covered a lot here, but I'm curious about something you mentioned before, thorough documentation.
Yes.
What does that mean in this context?
It means the doctor's report has to be incredibly detailed. They can't just say, this is the impairment rating.
Right.
They have to explain how they got there,
Oh.
reference the specific parts of the AMA guides they used, and justify every decision.
So it's like showing your work in math class.
Exactly.
You got to show all the steps, not just the answer.
Exactly. Keeps things transparent and accountable.
Okay, so we've got the AMA guides, the QME process, meticulous documentation.
That's a lot. I know.
It is. But I'm still really curious about those unusual cases where the standard rules might not work.
Right. The Almaraz-Guzman standard.
Yeah.
That's when things get even more interesting.
Okay, so maybe we should recap what we've learned so far.
Sounds good.
And then we can dive into Almaraz-Guzman.
Perfect.
This deep dive is definitely getting deeper.
Oh, yeah.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground already. My brain is definitely working overtime.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, for sure.
But it's starting to make sense, like how all these pieces fit together.
I think a recap would be good.
Yeah, let's recap.
Okay, so the goal is to figure out how much a work injury or illness has affected someone's ability to, just function.
Right, not just physically, but like in their everyday life and their
Yeah.
ability to work.
Exactly.
And we talked about how it's not just about the initial injury, right?
No, it's not.
It's also about the treatment and any assistive devices they might need.
Right. We have to consider the whole picture.
Okay, and then we got into impairment versus disability.
Mm-hmm.
Impairment being the actual loss of function.
Right, like the medical problem itself.
And disability is how that impairment affects their life.
Exact.
And of course, we talked about the doctors, those medical detectives who are evaluating the worker,
They're key.
using the AMA guides as their rule book.
Their guide, yeah.
And then there's a QME process for when there are disagreements.
Right, that second opinion.
It's fascinating how it all comes together.
It is. And speaking of, remember we talked about the DEU?
Yeah, the Disability Evaluation Unit.
They're the ones who actually crunch the numbers and come up with the disability rating.
Right. But I'm still a little fuzzy on what they do.
Okay.
Like, how do they take all that information and turn it into a number?
They use a tool called the Schedule for Rating Permanent Disabilities.
The Schedule for Rating Permanent Disabilities.
It's basically a big table that connects different impairment levels to disability ratings.
Okay.
But it's not as simple as just plugging in a number and getting an answer.
So it's not like 20% impairment equals a specific percentage of disability.
Not exactly.
What else do they look at?
They also look at things like the worker's age, their job, and how the impairment affects their ability to do that specific job.
Oh, that makes sense.
So a 20% impairment for a hand injury could mean different things for, say, a pianist versus a computer programmer.
Right, because their jobs require different things from their hands.
Exactly. So two people with the same impairment could end up with totally different disability ratings.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It is. It's about the individual.
So the DEU has to look at the whole picture.
The big picture, yes.
The medical stuff, the worker's situation, and how it all impacts their life.
Precisely.
It's like solving a really complicated puzzle.
That's a good way to put it. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all system.
Okay, so the doctor sends their report, the DEU looks at it, considers all these other details, and then we have the disability rating, right?
Well, not so fast.
Oh, there's more.
Remember how we talked about disagreements and the QME process?
Yeah, this second opinion.
Even after the DEU gives a rating, someone can still appeal it.
Really? So there are ways to challenge the rating if you think it's wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For workers without a lawyer, they can ask the DEU to look at it again.
Okay.
And if they're still not happy, they can go to a workers' compensation judge.
Wow, so it's not just a take it or leave it situation.
Not at all.
There's room for discussion and maybe even changing the rating.
Exactly.
That's good to know.
The goal is for the system, to be fair.
Okay, so it sounds like they've really tried to build in safeguards.
They have. It's about protecting people's livelihoods.
That's really reassuring to hear.
Good.
Okay, let's circle back to that Almaraz-Guzman standard you mentioned.
Yes.
We've talked about the AMA guides as the rulebook, the QME process for disagreements, and the DEU's role in calculating the rating.
Right.
Where does Almaraz-Guzman fit in?
It's kind of like a secret weapon.
A secret weapon. Okay, tell me more.
It's for those really unusual cases where the AMA guides just don't quite work.
So even with all the details and rules we've talked about,
Yeah.
there are still situations where the system needs to, like, bend the rules a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes, even with the best evaluations, the standard approach just doesn't really show the full impact on the worker.
And that can lead to an unfair outcome.
Right, and that's where Almaraz-Guzman comes in.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued.
Good.
Can you give me an example of when they might use Almaraz-Guzman?
Sure. Let's say someone hurts their back at work,
Okay.
and the AMA guides say it's a pretty minor impairment.
Oh.
But because of their specific job, even that minor impairment means they can't work at all.
Oh, I see. So the rating doesn't really reflect how badly they're affected.
Exactly, and that's when you might use Almaraz-Guzman.
So it allows the doctor to consider other things, right?
Right.
Not just the AMA guides.
Right. They can look at things like the worker's job duties, their age, their education, even how easy it would be for them to find a new job.
So it's about making sure the rating really shows how much the worker has lost in terms of earning money.
Exactly.
So it's like a safety valve.
Yeah, a safety.
Prevent the system from being too rigid.
I like that. A safety valve.
But doesn't that mean doctors could just ignore the AMA guides whenever they want?
That's a good question.
Wouldn't that lead to problems?
Well, Alvarez-Guzman has rules too. It's not a free-for-all.
Okay.
The doctor can't just decide to throw out the AMA guides.
Right.
They have to have solid medical reasons for doing it.
So they have to show why the normal rating isn't fair in this case.
Exactly. And they have to explain their reasoning very clearly.
So it's more like a carefully considered exception, not just a loophole.
Exactly. And that's why good documentation is so important in these cases.
Makes sense.
The doctor has to lay out all their evidence and reasoning very clearly.
So Almor-Dazman is all about finding that balance between flexibility and accountability.
Yes, it's about fairness for both the worker and the employer.
This is all so fascinating. We've gone from the basics to some really complex stuff.
We have, and it's all connected.
It is, and I'm starting to see why you said this is more interesting than people might think.
I told you.
So what's even more interesting is how all this involves medicine, law, and individual people's situations.
It's true. It's not just about numbers and rules.
Right, it's about real people's lives.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to have skilled people making these decisions.
Okay, we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Anything else we need to touch on about the process?
I think we've hit the main points.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that this system is always changing.
Oh, right, because laws and court decisions can affect things.
Exactly. It's a dynamic field, so staying up to date is crucial.
Great point. Okay, so for our listener who's been with us this whole time, what are some key things they should remember?
I think the most important thing is that knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power, yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as workers' comp.
Right, because whether you're an employer or an employee, understanding the system can really help you.
Exactly. It's about being informed and knowing your rights.
Absolutely. And I think another key takeaway is that this isn't a black and white process.
No, it's not.
There's a lot of gray area, a lot of judgment calls.
That's why it's so important to have clear guidelines, skilled professionals, and a focus on fairness.
I totally agree. And for anyone who wants to learn more, I encourage you to dig deeper.
Go for it.
The AMA guides are public, and there's tons of info online about Almor-Guzman and California workers' comp in general.
It's a fascinating world to explore.
It really is. And it reminds us that even in a system with rules, there's still room for human judgment and compassion.
Beautifully said.
Okay, that was a lot to take in, but incredibly helpful. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive,
Yes.
I want to talk more about something we touched on earlier. Documentation.
Oh, yes. Documentation.
It seems like it's really crucial in this whole process.
It can't be overstated, really. Documentation is key to everything.
Okay, so tell me more about why it's so important.
Well, it's about creating a clear record of everything that happened during the evaluation,
Okay.
from the very first medical exam to the final disability rating.
So you're talking about more than just filling out forms, right?
Right. It's about capturing all the details, the doctor's observations, their reasoning, everything.
And why is all that so important?
Well, for one thing, it ensures transparency.
Transparent.
Everyone involved can see exactly what happened, how the decisions were made.
Like a trail of breadcrumbs. You can follow the whole process. Okay, so that's good for the worker, right? They know how they got their rating.
Exactly, and it's good for the employer, too.
How so?
They need to understand the reasoning behind the rating.
Makes sense. And if there are any costs associated with the claim?
They can justify them.
Okay, so transparency is a big one, but what else?
Accountability. With good documentation, we know who did what, when, and why.
So it helps make sure everyone is following the rules.
Exactly, and that any mistakes can be easily found.
It's like a built-in quality control system.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, transparency and accountability. Anything else?
Oh yeah, documentation is also essential if a case goes to court.
Of course.
The judge needs to see the whole picture, the medical evidence, the reasoning behind the rating.
So it's like building a case file.
Exactly. You need to have all the evidence organized and ready to go.
And in some cases, having good documentation can actually prevent things from going to court.
That's right. If everyone has the same information and understands how things work,
then it's easier to reach an agreement.
Exactly.
So good documentation can actually save time, money, and stress in the long run.
Absolutely. It's worth the effort.
Okay, so documentation is about fairness, transparency, and accountability.
All of the above.
It's not just a formality, it's a crucial part of the whole process.
Couldn't agree more. And it comes back to that human element we keep talking about.
All right, the fact that there are real people making these decisions.
Exactly. And they need all the information they can get to make fair and accurate judgments.
That was a really good point about documentation.
Yeah, it's more than just paperwork.
Yeah, like it's really
It's
about...
transparency.
Yeah, and accountability.
Mm.
And it kind of highlights how like there are real people behind all this, right?
Yeah, it's not just a system, it's people making decisions.
Right, like physicians and DEU raters, they're the ones using their judgment.
Exactly. They're applying the rules, but they're also using their expertise.
And it's reassuring to know there are safeguards.
Like Almaraz Guzman?
Yeah, Almaraz Guzman to make sure things are fair.
Exactly. It's there for those cases where the AMA guides might not tell the whole story.
Right, it's about making sure the rating really reflects what the worker's going through.
Their loss of earning capacity, yeah.
Thinking back to that example of the worker with the back injury,
Mhm.
seemingly minor, but it prevented them from working.
Right. Without Almaraz Guzman, they might have been stuck with a rating that didn't really reflect their situation.
It's like a safety net or,
Safety valve.
yeah, a safety valve to
Hmm.
make sure the system isn't too rigid.
And that's important.
It is. So we've got the AMA guides, the QME process, the DEU, Almaraz Guzman.
It's a lot.
It is a lot, but it's all connected, right?
Yeah.
To protect both workers and employers.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah, like you said, it's a system, but there's also that human element.
Always.
It's not just about following the rules blindly.
It's about applying them fairly.
Okay, so this deep dive has really made me appreciate the role of physicians in all of this.
They're at the heart of it.
They're not just assessing injuries, they're like interpreting the AMA guides, making judgments about consistency.
And sometimes even using Almaraz Guzman.
It's a lot of responsibility.
Yes.
Like they have to consider the worker's effort during the evaluation, right?
Mm-hmm. Make sure they're not exaggerating or downplaying their limitations.
That seems tricky, finding that balance.
It's definitely a skill.
This has been eye-opening, honestly. I never realized how complex this system is.
It is complex, but it's there for a reason.
To protect workers.
And make sure they're treated fairly.
Okay, so for our listeners, what are the key things they should remember?
Well, like we said before, knowledge is power.
Right. The more you know about the system,
The better equipped you are.
to understand your rights and navigate the process.
Exactly.
And we should emphasize that this system is always changing, right?
Oh, absolutely.
With new laws and court decisions, so staying informed is crucial.
Couldn't agree more.
And if anyone's feeling a little overwhelmed, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yes, reach out.
Whether you're an employer or a worker, there are resources available
There are people who can answer your questions.
and guide you through the process.
It's a complicated system, but it's there to help.
Right, to protect workers who have been injured on the job.
That's the goal.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much.
We do.
It's been a journey, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as well.
I hope so.
We've gone from the big picture to the tiny details.
All the way down to the importance of documentation.
And if this has sparked your interest, we encourage you to keep exploring.
There's so much more to discover.
So until next time, keep diving deep.